Chapter 13 Reformations and Religious Wars. Part 1 The Early Reformation.
The Adventures of Martin Luther.
In the last chapter, we talked about the trend in the Renaissance to move towards more secular ideals. But the truth was that in the early 16th century, most Europeans were deeply religious people. People of all social groups devoted an enormous amount of time and of their income to various religious causes and foundations. But many people were also beginning to become critical of the Roman Catholic Church, and in particular the clergy. Their prestige had been damaged by the Babylonian captivity, another name for the Avignon papacy, the resulting Great Schism.
He's over there.
And 15th century popes' concentration on artistic patronage and the building up of family power. Papal tax collection methods were attacked, and some were criticizing the papacy itself and the wealth and the powerful courts of this church hierarchy. Some groups and individuals argued that certain church doctrines, such as the veneration of saints, the centrality of the sacraments, were incorrect and suggested measures to reform and improve these institutions. There's also just widespread anti-clericalism. The opposition to the clergy was really focused on three things: the immorality of many church officials, the fact that many church officials used their positions for their own benefit, and the fact that there was a large amount of collecting of church positions to increase their wealth, and so therefore a charge of absenteeism. Many clerics held positions in England, Spain, and Germany while never visiting them, and so they'd hire some poor priest to fulfill the spiritual duties of that particular local church. But this led to a large degree of resentment against these foreign officials. Priests, monks, and nuns also enjoyed a number of exemptions and privileges. They didn't have to pay taxes or defend the cities that they were in, despite these massive land holdings. So city governments began to try to limit the privileges of these groups. Urban leaders also wanted to have some say in appointing these high church officials rather than having them appointed by Rome, because again, you see this conflict between the papacy and these Italian church officials and the local leaders who are feeling their communities are not truly being served. Into this situation stepped the German monk and university professor Martin Luther.
An exciting and controversial examination of the Protestant reformer whose reassessment of the role of the individual in Christian belief shook the foundations of a post-feudal Germany in the grip of the 16th century.
Luther was very concerned with his own salvation. He believed that, that the teachings of the Catholic Church meant that he was likely going to end up in hell. Luther began to study, though, St. Paul's letters in the New Testament, and that led him to change his beliefs into the fact that justification, being made right with God, came through faith, and that this was a gift of God's grace, not the result of human effort. So at the same time that this was going on, the Pope was increasing this sale of indulgences. This was to finance building plans in Rome. An indulgence was a piece of parchment signed by the Pope or another church official that substituted a virtuous act from the treasury of merits for penance or time in purgatory. This led Luther to write his 95 Theses, which he may have attached to a cathedral door.
One of them is nailing something to the door of the cathedral. I've created Lutherans.
Whether that moment happened or not really isn't that important. We do know that afterwards, Martin Luther published a series of pamphlets in which he argued that the Pope and church councils could err, that secular leaders should reform the church if church leaders did not, and that requiring clergy to be celibate was futile. His appearance created a broader audience for reform throughout Central Europe, and other individuals began to preach and publish against existing doctrines. The papacy responded with their own letter condemning some of Martin Luther's positions, ordering that his books be burned and giving him 2 months to recant or be excommunicated. Luther's theological issues that he is raising become interwoven with public controversies about the church's wealth, power, and structure.
I'm never going to church again.
Homer, are you actually giving up your faith?
No. Well, yeah.
One such figure was the Swiss humanist priest and an admirer of Erasmus, Ulrich Zwingli. He was convinced that Christian life rested on the Scripture, which were the pure words of God and the sole basis of religious truth. Like Luther, he's going to attack the selling of indulgences, but he's also going to be opposed to Mass and monasticism in general. He's going to lead some gradual reform of the church in Zurich, but he's going to have the strong support of city authorities who resented the privileges of the clergy to back him up. The followers of Luther, Zwingli, and others who called for a break with Rome came to be called Protestants, and it's a name derived from a group of reforming German princes who protested the decisions of the Catholic majority at the Diet of Sepper in 1529. This word gradually came to apply to all non-Catholic Western European Christians. Protestants held that salvation came by faith alone, meaning good works or the actions of humans in general meant nothing, and it was all up to God.
King of the Britons. Oh, don't grovel. One thing I can't stand, it's people groveling. Sorry. And don't apologize. Every time I try to talk to someone, it's sorry this and forgive me that, and I'm not worthy.
This meant that for Protestants, authority rested in the Bible alone. Protestants tended to reject Catholic teachings about the sacraments, holding that only baptism and the Eucharist have scriptural support. Protestants held that the church is a spiritual priesthood of all believers, not a hierarchical clerical institution headed by the Pope in Rome, and they argued that every person could serve God in his or her individual calling. These various Protestants gathered in the Colloquy of Marburg in 1529, and they were able to reach agreement on every issue of importance except one, and that was the issue of the Eucharist.
Reginald, I disagree.
Luther believed in consubstantiation, which was the belief that the faith of the person consuming the bread and wine turned it into the body and blood of Christ, whereas Zwingli held that this was a purely symbolic act. Despite these differences, Protestantism is going to spread rapidly throughout Europe. The ideas behind it appealed to a wide variety of people. Educated people and many humanists were attracted to Luther's idea of a simpler personal religion based on faith and a return to the spirit of the early church. Many townspeople were attracted by the notion that the clergy should also pay taxes and should not have legal privileges. Historians frequently ask why Protestantism is successful in the 16th century compared to earlier reform movements, and a common answer is the printing press's ability to spread ideas rapidly. Luther's skill in language should also be considered an important factor, but probably most important was the fact that both Zwingli and Luther identified support from local leaders as the way to spread their ideas and not end up like Jan Hus. Nobles saw a chance to claim church property for themselves by accepting Luther's ideas.
Stealing! How could you? Haven't you learned anything from that guy who gives those sermons at church? Captain, what's his name?
Not all Protestant groups sought to work with local leaders like Zwingli and Luther did. One of the more famous groups was called the Anabaptists, who believed that baptism should be reserved for adult believers. A radical group of Anabaptists took over the city of Munster, and they basically predicted that this would be the site of a new Jerusalem that would survive God's final judgment. They called for communal ownership of property. They expelled those who refused rebaptism. And it took a combined army of Catholic and Protestants to siege the city and to expel the radicals there. The radicals' unwillingness to accept a state church marked them as social outcasts, and Anabaptists and other radicals were banished or cruelly executed. These radical ideas survived and influenced the traditions of Quakers, Baptists, Congregationalists, and even the authors of the U.S. Constitution. Another way in which radical Protestant ideas influenced the general population of Europe can be found in the German peasant revolts. Massive crop failures in 1523 and 1524 aggravated deteriorating economic conditions, and so peasants looked to these radical leaders and the writings of Martin Luther to cite for calls for reform. Initially, Luther sides with the peasants, but when the rebellion breaks out, he condemns it, and this is where you kind of see why Lutheranism is more successful in being spread versus, say, the Anabaptists. The nobility crushed this revolt violently, and a lot of the popular appeal of this program disappears after the 1525 Peasant Rebellion. So while the Protestant Reformation confirmed itself as not being a radical economic and political movement, there were many important social changes. One of the most important is the fact that Protestant reformers didn't view marriage as a sacrament, and that has a couple of important effects. One, it allowed members of the clergy to marry. Both Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli are going to marry themselves, and that's a powerful message about the Protestants' belief on
marriage.
Marriage was seen as a contract, and that it meant that divorce was acceptable. However, Protestant reformers were very keen to maintain traditional gender roles and saw that women were subject to men. And the Protestant Reformation is very mixed in terms of benefits for women. On the one hand, divorce was now available as an option, even if it was still limited. On the other, the Protestant Reformation shut down many of the monasteries and convents, which eliminated many literary, artistic, medical, or administrative avenues for women who could not or would not marry, which meant that marriage was basically the only occupation for upper-class Protestant women, and thus made unmarried women suspect. Protestants were also very harsh on prostitution and frequently sought to close brothels and set very harsh punishments for prostitution, but this, of course, does not end the exchange of sex for money. A few women wrote religious works, and female rulers set religious policies, but 16th century Protestants did not allow women to be members of the clergy as a general rule. Next, we will discuss the spread of Protestant ideals.